They laughed at him. Not for a mistake, but for simply existing in her classroom. Malcolm Carter, 16, scribbled quietly, while whispers and scoffs filled the air. Then he saw it, a pattern so impossible, so brilliant, it could undo everything they thought they knew. She scoffed, called it luck. But what he built next would leave her speechless, and when she finally looked at his work, everything changed. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Malcolm Carter stepped into room 214, his backpack slung over one shoulder, the faint hum of fluorescent lights above casting a sterile glow over the rows of desks. It was a room that had witnessed countless calculations, a dozen ambitious students scribbling away at their notebooks, and countless egos tested against the rigid standards of Ms. Whitmore's advanced calculus class. Malcolm's heartbeat quickened as he crossed the threshold. He had spent the summer revising every theorem, memorizing formulas, and working through problem sets his peers hadn't even glanced at. This was his chance to prove himself, not just as a student but as a young black boy who had grown tired of being underestimated at every turn. The air shifted the moment he walked in. Miss Whitmore, a woman whose reputation preceded her like a shadow, glanced up from her desk and let out a faint, almost imperceptible scoff. It wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of decades of unspoken bias, a subtle dismissal that pricked at Malcolm's confidence in a way that few would notice, unless they had been on the receiving end. He swallowed, trying not to flinch, but he could feel the scrutiny, the invisible line that divided him from the other students. Some classmates' eyes flicked toward him, a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. A few smirked quietly, the faintest trace of inherited prejudice from years of observing authority figures like Miss Whitmore. The room was silent except for the soft scratching of pens against paper, the distant hum of the air conditioning, and the occasional click of a calculator. Malcolm walked to his usual seat near the window, placing his notebook carefully on the desk. He wanted to appear calm, collected, as if he belonged here, even though every part of his body screamed otherwise. Miss Whitmore's gaze lingered on him longer than necessary, sharp and calculating, like she was measuring him against some invisible standard he could never hope to reach. Her lips twitched in a way that might have been mistaken for thoughtfulness, but Malcolm knew better. He had seen that expression before. It was the same look his cousin had described when he was dismissed in a history class, the same look his father had described when job interviews subtly shifted after he mentioned his college. It was the look that reminded him, silently but clearly, that no matter how good he was, he would always have to work twice as hard, prove himself twice as thoroughly, just to exist in the space that others took for granted. The day's lesson began with Ms. Whitmore writing on the chalkboard, her handwriting crisp, precise, almost surgical in its clarity. Formulas sprawled across the board, intertwining in ways that seemed both intimidating and hypnotic. Malcolm's eyes scanned the equations, noting the patterns, the sequences. While some students scribbled mechanically, he felt something stir within him, a spark of curiosity that refused to be dimmed by the weight of prejudice. He traced one sequence with his eyes, imagining a solution unfolding, shapes and numbers dancing in his mind in a rhythm no one else could perceive. A whisper rippled across the room. One of his classmates leaned slightly toward another, murmuring something Malcolm couldn't catch. He knew what it was before he even heard it, a subtle commentary on his presence, an echo of the biases that had followed him since middle school. It wasn't overt, not cruelly enough to provoke confrontation, but precise enough to make him question whether his seat at this table was truly his own. Malcolm adjusted his notebook, tapping his pencil against the paper, trying to ground himself. Every fiber of his being wanted to shrink, to become invisible, but he refused. Ms. Whitmore spoke, her voice steady and authoritative, the kind of voice that commanded attention and demanded compliance. Today we will explore the intricacies of nonlinear differential equations and their applications in real-world modeling, she announced, her tone precise but carrying an undercurrent of skepticism toward Malcolm. As she turned to the board, she continued without acknowledging his presence, as if he were a shadow in the room, present yet inconsequential. Malcolm felt the sting but let it settle quietly in his chest. He had learned early that reacting often invited ridicule, sometimes worse. Instead, he focused on the board, tracing the chalk lines, immersing himself in the rhythm of the equations. Numbers and symbols became his shield, a language that transcended bias, a sanctuary where intelligence was measured by precision, not skin color. The whispers persisted, faint but constant. A classmate muttered a joke under their breath. Another smirked knowingly at the remark, glancing at Malcolm to gauge his reaction. He forced himself to ignore it, focusing instead on the patterns emerging from the chaos of the chalkboard. With every scribble, every calculation, he felt a quiet resolve building within him, a determination to let his work speak louder than their prejudice. And then he saw it. On the far side of the board, Ms. Whitmore had written an equation that looked impossibly complex, a problem that seemed almost deliberately designed to intimidate, its variables intertwined in a web of uncertainty, its solution hidden beneath layers of abstraction. Most students stared at it blankly, some jotting down notes mechanically, others whispering to one another in subtle panic. But Malcolm's eyes lit up. Something about the equation sparked a fire in him, a silent promise of challenge, a whisper of possibility. It was as if the complexity itself was a dare, a direct invitation to prove that intelligence cannot be contained or dismissed by subtle smirks and quiet biases. For the first time that morning, Malcolm felt a surge of exhilaration. The classroom, with all its whispers, stares, and unspoken judgments, faded into the background. The equation became the center of his world, a puzzle he could solve, a truth he could uncover. As he leaned forward, pencil hovering over his notebook, his mind racing through potential solutions, he felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. The weight of being underestimated, dismissed and subtly mocked, only sharpened his focus. Each symbol on the chalkboard seemed to pulse with possibility, and Malcolm felt the stirrings of something powerful. A theorem, a breakthrough, an answer that could not be ignored. The classroom seemed to hold its breath. Ms. Whitmore adjusted her glasses, glancing briefly at Malcolm, with an imperceptible raise of her brow. Her eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity, a hint that perhaps this boy was not as inconsequential as she had assumed. Malcolm, sensing the unspoken tension, felt his heart hammer with a mixture of excitement and dread. Then, just as he began to sketch the first tentative lines of what might become a solution, a sharp, mocking laugh echoed from the back of the room. It was not loud, but it sliced through the quiet, a reminder of the scrutiny he faced. Heads turned toward him, a few stifling giggles, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Malcolm's pulse quickened, his fingers gripping the pencil tighter. He knew the classroom was waiting for a mistake, a falter, a sign that he did not belong. But deep inside, something hardened. The equation on the board no longer intimidated him. It beckoned. It was a challenge issued not just by mathematics, but by the subtle cruelty of those who doubted him. And Malcolm Carter, 16 years old, black underestimated, and ignored, felt the first thrill of defiance stir within him. He traced the variables, considered the relationships, imagined a path forward, a path no one expected him to find. As the bell for the next period neared, Malcolm's eyes stayed fixed on the chalkboard. The equation waited, silently daring him, a puzzle full of potential, a silent accusation against the dismissals and scoffs that had defined the morning. And in that charged, electric moment, he realized something. This was no ordinary problem. Solving it could change how the world saw him, and perhaps even force Miss Whitmore to see him differently. And then, as he leaned closer to begin writing, he noticed a subtle pattern in the variables, a connection that seemed almost hidden, as if placed there by fate rather than chance. His pulse quickened, the spark of possibility ignited into something fierce. Malcolm's hand hovered over his notebook, trembling slightly with anticipation, because he knew, with a certainty that both terrified and exhilarated him, that this equation could be the start of something that no one, not even Miss Whitmore, could ignore. Malcolm's pencil touched the paper, and as the first line of his solution took shape, he realized the pattern on the board was more than a challenge. It was a key that could unlock a theorem so unexpected that it might expose not only his brilliance, but the biases hiding in plain sight. Malcolm Carter's hand hesitated mid-air as Miss Whitmore called on him to solve a problem from the morning's lecture. His eyes met hers, searching for even a flicker of acknowledgement or encouragement, but all he found was that same cold, detached gaze. She didn't just ignore his potential, she seemed almost intent on diminishing it, correcting his every word with subtle condescension. Not quite, Malcolm. Perhaps you should revisit the definition of the Laplace transform, she said, her voice clipped but carrying a weight that made it clear she believed he had no hope of getting it right. The classroom fell silent, every student momentarily distracted from their own calculations to witness the interaction. Malcolm's stomach tightened. The sting wasn't in the correction itself. It was the assumption, the underlying dismissal that his intelligence wasn't enough to be taken seriously. He forced a nod, masking the flush rising in his cheeks. Around him, whispered comments circulated like ghosts in the room. A classmate muttered under their breath, a subtle echo of Ms. Whitmore's disapproval. "I guess he's just lucky sometimes." Another tittered quietly, smothering laughter with a hand over their mouth. Malcolm felt eyes on him, not with curiosity or respect, but with the expectation that he would fail. It wasn't the first time Malcolm had been underestimated. He had grown accustomed to the quiet, persistent doubts cast by teachers and peers alike. At school, at home, even during standardized tests, the subtle biases followed him. He had learned to navigate them, to absorb the sting without allowing it to break him. But moments like this carried a unique sharpness, a public questioning of his right to exist in spaces of intellectual rigor. As Ms. Whitmore moved to the next student, Malcolm opened his notebook, trying to regain control of his own focus. His hand trembled slightly as he scribbled numbers and symbols, not because he doubted his ability, but because the humiliation lingered like a shadow over every line he wrote. The board's equation from earlier, the one that had sparked that quiet thrill of possibility, still glowed in his memory, almost teasing him, promising a challenge he could conquer if only he could escape the weight of judgment surrounding him. He glanced at his classmates. Most were absorbed in their own work, but a few glanced at him surreptitiously, their expressions a mix of pity, curiosity, and judgment. Malcolm could almost see the calculations in their minds. Will he embarrass himself again? It was a question that had haunted him all his academic life, a silent barrier imposed by perception, rather than reality. He clenched his jaw and returned to the notebook, feeling the familiar duality of anger and determination rise within him. The problem Ms. Whitmore had assigned was deceptively simple in presentation, but layered with intricate complexities that required abstract thinking. Malcolm traced the variables, slowly untangling the threads, mapping patterns others might overlook. His mind raced faster than his pen could keep up. Each symbol, each coefficient became a stepping stone toward a larger insight, a possibility no one else seemed able to see. But every time he made a note, he felt the subtle judgment pressing down, whispering that brilliance alone would never be enough. It was in this atmosphere of scrutiny that the classroom microaggressions became almost unbearable. Whitmore didn't need to openly ridicule him. Her disapproval was built into every correction, every careful now, and perhaps you've misunderstood that left his answers hanging in a limbo of doubt. It was as if she assumed his intelligence was contingent, fragile and unworthy of full attention. Malcolm felt the sting of erasure, of having his presence questioned simply for daring to occupy the space. Despite the oppressive weight of the room, Malcolm noticed something curious. Patterns in the problems that seemed disconnected to his classmates began to align in his mind. An unspoken order emerged from the chaos. Subtle correlations that hinted at a more elegant solution, one that transcended the limits of the classroom. He began to sketch quietly in the margin of his notebook, lines crossing, intersecting, spiraling into forms that only he could decipher. As he wrote, he felt a strange exhilaration, a small rebellion building in the quiet corners of his consciousness. Here, in the margins, he was free. Free from the judgment, the laughter, the scoff. Free from the idea that his presence had to be justified with perfection. Free to explore the boundaries of mathematics without the burden of proving his worth to those who doubted him. But even in this refuge, the tension of the classroom pressed against him. Ms. Whitmore moved about the room, her eyes scanning the desks with the practiced detachment of someone who believed she held authority by virtue of inherited intelligence and position. She paused briefly at Malcolm's desk, leaning slightly closer to glance at his work. Her expression was inscrutable, but Malcolm felt it as a challenge, a silent test of whether he would conform to the low expectations she had silently imposed. A subtle twist struck Malcolm in that moment. For the first time, he realized that the derision he faced wasn't just personal, it was performative. His presence in the class threatened a narrative, a story about who could excel in this space. The laughter, the corrections, the whispered judgments, they were all part of a larger expectation, that he would fail quietly, that his brilliance would be contained, or ignored. And now, with that understanding, a flicker of strategic defiance lit within him. He continued sketching, each mark on the paper, a quiet rebellion. The equations formed into something more cohesive, an emerging theorem that only he could see. It was subtle, elegant, a puzzle that had been hiding in plain sight. Malcolm felt a thrill of possibility unlike anything he had experienced in a classroom before. He knew, deep down, that if he could bring this insight to light, it would shake the foundations of Miss Whitmore's assumptions, and perhaps those of the entire room. At the same time, doubt threatened to creep in. What if he was misreading the patterns? What if the theorem he glimpsed only existed in the realm of imagination and not in the rigid logic of mathematics? The weight of potential humiliation pressed against his ribs, reminding him that success here would not only require intellect but emotional fortitude. He had faced scorn before, but never so public, never so calculated, and never so deeply entwined with the unspoken biases of authority. A sudden whispered comment from a classmate jolted him slightly. "He's probably just guessing again," someone murmured. Malcolm's chest tightened, a familiar flush of anger and humiliation mixing with determination. He refused to react outwardly. Instead, he let the words fuel him. If they expected him to falter, they had miscalculated. If they assumed his work was guesswork, they were about to be proven wrong. The class continued in its measured rhythm. Miss Whitmore moved to the next problem, her attention scanning the room like a lighthouse sweeping over dark waters. Malcolm, unnoticed for the moment, continued to sketch patterns, his mind racing, mapping connections that no one else seemed capable of perceiving. Each line of the theorem he began to outline felt like a silent counter-argument to the prejudice surrounding him, a proof not only of skill but of resilience, of quiet defiance against systemic dismissal. By the time the bell approached, signaling the end of class, Malcolm had begun to see the outline of a solution, a theorem that could not be ignored. The whispers and side glances, the subtle scoffs, the assumed incompetence, all of it coalesced into a fuel that propelled his mind forward. He looked up at Ms. Whitmore, sensing for the first time that she had noticed the unusual focus in his work, the precision and clarity that went beyond mere guesswork. And then, just as he lifted his pencil to begin formalizing the first proof, a startling realization struck him. The pattern he had been following didn't just solve today's problem. It extended further, hinting at a broader principle, a theorem that could challenge assumptions not only about mathematics, but about the subtle biases that had dictated his experience in the room. The weight of the discovery made his hands shake slightly. Malcolm knew that if he attempted to reveal this theorem now, it could either expose him to ridicule or force Ms. Whitmore and the entire class to confront a truth they had been avoiding. And as the last seconds of the period ticked away, he realized that the path he was on might not just solve an equation, it might upend every expectation that had ever tried to define him. Malcolm stepped out of room 2014, the hallway buzzing with the usual post-class chatter, lockers slamming, students laughing and complaining about homework, entirely unaware of the storm of subtle injustice he had endured just moments ago. He tried to appear composed, sliding his notebook into his backpack, though the faint sting of humiliation lingered in his chest. Every correction, every suppressed smirk, every whisper in class had left its mark. He could feel it in the tension of his shoulders, in the tightness around his jaw. Each step toward the exit felt heavy, burdened with the unspoken weight of expectation and dismissal. "Hey!" A familiar voice called from the side of the hallway. Jordan Taylor, Malcolm's best friend since middle school, appeared, leaning casually against a locker with that easy, confident posture that contrasted sharply with Malcolm's taut composure. Jordan's sharp eyes immediately caught the subtle signs of distress in Malcolm's expression. The tight fists, the slightly reddened ears, the downward tilt of his gaze. Without needing words, Jordan knew that the classroom had not been kind. "You okay, man?" Jordan asked quietly, lowering his voice as a group of students passed by. There was no judgment in his tone, only concern, the kind that came from knowing someone inside and out. Malcolm hesitated, trying to form a response, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he shrugged, a small gesture of defiance mixed with embarrassment. Jordan didn't press at first. He had learned that sometimes support meant waiting, letting a friend navigate their own storm, before offering a lifeline. But as they started walking down the corridor together, Jordan leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping even further, almost conspiratorial. "Ignore her. You're not the problem, Malcolm. You know that, right?" Malcolm wanted to respond, wanted to argue, but his mind was crowded with the echo of Ms. Whitmore's scoff, the laughter from the back of the classroom, the judgmental gazes of his peers. He knew Jordan was right. He always was. But acknowledgement didn't make the sting any easier to bear. The constant weight of microaggressions, those subtle, often invisible cues that questioned his worth, pressed on him in a way that was exhausting, unrelenting. At lunch, Malcolm and Jordan found a quiet corner in the library, away from the chaos of crowded tables and clattering trays. The smell of old books mingled with the faint hum of fluorescent lights, a small refuge where they could talk without interruption. Malcolm opened his notebook, carefully flipping to the page where he had begun sketching the patterns in Miss Whitmore's equation. His pencil hovered above the paper, hesitant but drawn to the faint lines he had already traced. "You've been staring at that thing all day," Jordan observed, leaning over slightly, peering at the complex calculations. "It's like you're seeing something everyone else can't." "I've seen you before, Malcolm. When you get like this, you're onto something." Malcolm felt a flicker of encouragement, though it was mingled with doubt. Jordan's words were genuine, yet they reminded him of the delicate balance he had to maintain. Brilliance had to be shown carefully, cautiously, or risk becoming a target for ridicule. He exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease just slightly. I think I see a connection," he admitted quietly. "Something that ties all the parts together. But it's complicated." Jordan's grin was reassuring. "Complicated is good. It means you're ahead of everyone else. Don't let her or anyone make you doubt that." His words carried more weight than mere encouragement. They were a lifeline against the constant tide of skepticism that Malcolm faced, a reminder that he wasn't navigating these waters alone. Later that evening, at home, the tension of the day followed Malcolm upstairs like a persistent shadow. The quiet of his room, usually a sanctuary, was punctuated by the faint hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the floorboards below. His parents had already gone through their routine of asking about his day, offering the usual blend of pride and caution that came with raising a black boy in a world that often underestimated him. "You seem thoughtful tonight," his mother had said over dinner, her eyes soft with concern. "Is everything okay at school?" Malcolm hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. He didn't want to worry them further, but he also couldn't ignore the frustration and humiliation he felt. "It's fine," he said finally, though the tightness in his chest betrayed the simplicity of the words. "Just a lot of work in calculus." His father, who had always been a quiet observer of the world's injustices, nodded knowingly. "Remember, son, people will try to define you by their expectations, not your ability. Don't let anyone make you smaller than you are." The advice was familiar but no less potent. Malcolm felt a quiet surge of resolve in those words, a reminder that persistence in the face of prejudice wasn't just a choice, it was a necessity. Sitting at his desk later that night, Malcolm opened his notebook once more. The patterns he had traced in class now appeared more vivid, more intricate, more interconnected than ever. The faint spark of inspiration that had emerged in room 2014 now began to burn with quiet intensity. Each equation, each variable, seemed to whisper possibilities he hadn't seen before. His mind moved faster than his hand, sketching out tentative connections, testing assumptions, imagining a theorem that could bridge gaps no one else could perceive. The emotional weight of the day, the scoffs, the whispers, the subtle dismissals, transformed into fuel. Every unfair correction, every stifled laugh, every shadow of doubt became a force pushing him forward. He worked tirelessly, tracing lines, connecting symbols, and imagining the broader implications of what he was discovering. It was as if the injustice itself had guided his mind toward a solution, a form of brilliance that was uniquely his. And yet, even as excitement grew, Malcolm felt a small tremor of fear. What if he was misreading the patterns? What if the theorem he was beginning to visualize was only an illusion? A construct of wishful thinking fueled by his desire to prove himself in a world that had dismissed him at every turn. The thought lingered, gnawing at him, but it could not overpower the drive that had been building since the first scoff in Miss Whitmore's classroom. Jordan's words echoed in his mind, a subtle mantra against self-doubt. "Don't let her, or anyone, make you doubt that." Malcolm repeated it quietly to himself, grounding the fear, transforming it into determination. The theorem was no longer just an abstract puzzle. It had become a symbol of resilience, a quiet act of defiance against every microaggression, every whispered doubt, every systemic barrier that had ever questioned his worth. As midnight approached, Malcolm's hand flew across the page. The lines and symbols began to coalesce into something coherent, a structure emerging from the chaos. What had started as a small spark of curiosity in room 214 now threatened to become a fully formed theorem, one that no one in his class, perhaps not even Miss Whitmore, could dismiss. And then, in an unexpected twist, a pattern emerged that he hadn't anticipated, a hidden symmetry that suggested a broader principle, one that could redefine the problem entirely. It was as if the universe itself had conspired to give him a clue, a subtle nudge in the right direction, turning the small victory of understanding into something monumental. Malcolm leaned back, his eyes wide, heart pounding. The theorem wasn't just shaping up, it was becoming something transformative, something that could challenge authority, upset expectations, and force acknowledgement of not only his brilliance, but the biases that had attempted to contain it. As he traced the final connecting line in the knight's calculations, Malcolm realized that the theorem hinted at something far larger than any classroom problem. It could expose the subtle injustices lurking in every corner of his academic world. But before he could fully comprehend its implications, a soft knock at his bedroom door startled him, leaving him frozen with anticipation. The next morning, the halls of Eastbrook High buzzed with the usual energy, students complaining about homework, lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking on polished floors. But Malcolm Carter moved through it all with a quiet intensity, his notebook clutched like a shield. He had barely slept, the theorem from last night replaying in his mind like a film he couldn't pause. The hidden pattern, the symmetry, the subtle connection that had emerged. It all demanded attention, and he felt an unshakable certainty that what he was discovering could not be dismissed, even in Ms. Whitmore's class. Entering room 2114, he immediately noticed the tension in the air. Ms. Whitmore stood at her desk, a stack of papers in her hands, her expression unreadable. She announced, briskly and without preamble, that there would be a surprise quiz. A ripple of groans filled the room. Students muttered under their breath, fidgeting nervously. Malcolm's heart quickened, but not with fear. He welcomed the challenge. Quizzes had always been a battlefield where intellect could shine, or be judged unfairly. When the first question appeared on the page, Malcolm's eyes widened. It was more complex than expected. A problem that demanded not just formulaic application, but creative insight. The kind of question designed to separate those who understood concepts deeply from those who merely memorized. A few students stared blankly, pencils hovering hesitantly over their papers. Others whispered tentative answers to neighbors. Malcolm's pen, however, began moving almost automatically, tracing symbols with deliberate precision, guided by the connections he had discovered the night before. A murmur of surprise ran through the classroom when Malcolm's answer, neatly calculated and fully justified, appeared on his paper. He looked up at Ms. Whitmore expecting perhaps a nod of acknowledgement, or the faintest smile of recognition. Instead she laughed, a sharp, unmistakable laugh that echoed around the room, ringing cruel and unearned. "Well, isn't that lucky," she said, loud enough for every student to hear, framing his correct answer as nothing more than chance. The laughter that followed was deafening. Chairs scraped against the floor as students laughed at the perceived joke, some covering their mouths with their hands, others glancing at Malcolm with a mixture of incredulity and disbelief. He could feel their eyes on him, but not with curiosity or respect, only with the expectation that this brilliant solution could not possibly be genuine. The message was clear: you are not allowed to succeed, not on your own terms. Malcolm felt a burning flush rise in his chest, a mix of embarrassment, frustration, and disbelief. This was not merely ridicule. It was the insidious weight of systemic bias, a subtle but potent message that his intellect, his effort, and his ability were all being minimized because of who he was. He had answered correctly, had demonstrated understanding far beyond the superficial expectations of the classroom, and yet the response was designed to diminish, to isolate, to remind him of the invisible ceiling above him. He lowered his eyes to the paper, trying to maintain composure. Every laugh, every sideways glance, every whisper carved a subtle wound into his confidence, one that was familiar from years of being underestimated. He felt the pressure of scrutiny, of being judged not on merit but on expectation, as if the world had predetermined his failure before he had even picked up his pencil. The classroom, full of peers who had once smiled at him with encouragement or neutrality, now felt hostile, a space where brilliance was only tolerated if it aligned with their assumption. And yet, amid the sting of humiliation, something shifted within Malcolm. His anger, quiet and simmering, became fuel. He refused to let this moment define him. The laughter, the mockery, the subtle dismissal, it became a challenge, one that demanded an answer that could not be minimized or dismissed. His mind, still tracing the patterns from last night, began working faster, connecting threads, testing hypotheses, imagining new relationships between variables. The theorem that had been forming in secret now took on an urgency, a determination born from the sting of public ridicule. Unexpectedly, a few students began to glance at Malcolm differently, not with respect yet, but with curiosity. His calculated approach, the precision of his work, and the subtle confidence with which he scribbled solutions, hinted that perhaps there was more here than simple luck. They whispered to each other, tentative, unsure whether to believe in what they were seeing. But for Malcolm, Their judgment was secondary. This was no longer about being accepted by peers. It was about proving to himself that he could transcend the expectations imposed upon him by bias, ridicule, and assumption. As the quiz ended, and papers were collected, Ms. Whitmore's eyes lingered briefly on Malcolm's work. She did not speak, but her gaze was sharp, assessing, calculating, as though she had noticed the precision and clarity of his solution, yet was unwilling to publicly acknowledge it. Malcolm felt the tension, the silent scrutiny, as palpable as the weight of the room itself. The quiet humiliation, combined with the knowledge that he had succeeded in solving a problem designed to intimidate, stirred an obsessive determination within him. Later that afternoon, Malcolm returned to the quiet of his bedroom. The sting of Miss Whitmore's laughter and the classroom ridicule still lingered, but now it had transformed into something more potent, a driving force. He opened his notebook and began sketching a new formula, one that expanded upon the insights he had begun to uncover. Lines intersected with precise intent, variables connected in ways that challenged conventional methods, and the theorem slowly evolved into something undeniable, something that could leave no room for doubt. As he worked, the emotional weight of the day, the subtle prejudices, the public mockery, the quiet expectations of failure, melded with his intellectual focus, sharpening every calculation. The injustice he had faced became a tool, each insult and smirk encoded into the mathematics of his mind. By the time the room was bathed in the deep orange of sunset, a clear structure had begun to emerge, more elegant and powerful than he had imagined. And yet, even as exhilaration rose, a small unease lingered. Malcolm realized that the very act of discovery, the unfolding of a theorem that could defy expectations, might provoke more than admiration. In a system that had already shown bias, his brilliance could trigger resistance, subtle sabotage, or public undermining. The stakes were higher than ever. This theorem was not just a solution, it was a declaration of ability in a world conditioned to doubt him. In a surprising twist, Malcolm noticed something as he reviewed his work, a subtle error embedded in the assumptions of the original problem, one that had been overlooked by Miss Whitmore herself. It was minor, almost invisible, but significant enough that it had allowed a deeper solution to surface, his solution. The irony was not lost on him. The teacher who had dismissed him, laughed at him, and subtly questioned his intelligence, had inadvertently created the conditions for him to excel beyond her comprehension. The room was silent, except for the scratching of his pencil. Malcolm felt a rush of quiet triumph, tempered by caution. He knew that revealing this solution would challenge not only the boundaries of the problem, but the authority that had sought to contain him. Every line of the theorem became a quiet act of defiance, a proof not only of intellectual skill, but of resilience against systemic bias. As Malcolm traced the final line of his new formula, he realized that what he had begun was no longer just an answer to a quiz. It was the beginning of a theorem so undeniable, so precise, that when it emerged fully, it could expose the very prejudices hiding in plain sight within the classroom. And somewhere, across the school, Miss Whitmore's eyes were unknowingly about to meet the evidence of her own misjudgment. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that presses against the walls and makes every sound sharper. Malcolm Carter sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor, notebook balanced on his knees, pencil in hand, and a desk lamp casting a small circle of light across his sketches. Outside, the moon hung low, silver and distant, a silent witness to the world beyond his window. The laughter in room 2014, Ms. Whitmore's scoff, the murmurs of classmates, it all replayed in his mind, like a tape stretched taut across memory. The humiliation of the classroom had left its mark, but here, in this quiet, Malcolm transformed it into fuel. Every insult, every derisive glance became energy, power to shape something extraordinary. He leaned forward, pencil scratching across the page, translating intuition into numbers, abstraction into form. The theorem he had glimpsed during the day began to solidify, taking on structure, precision, and an elegance that startled even him. The patterns he had sketched in the margins of his notebook at school now extended across the page, spiraling, intersecting, revealing hidden connections that no one else in the room could have seen. Each line, each calculation, carried with it a quiet defiance, a refusal to let ignorance or bias define the value of his intellect. Malcolm's heart raced with a mix of exhilaration and fear. He knew the power of what he was creating, and the possibility that it could challenge authority loomed large. Whitmore had dismissed him publicly, her laughter echoing in the classroom, and leaving a sting that still lingered in his chest. Yet, That very dismissal had inadvertently created a proving ground for him, pushing him to explore beyond standard solutions, beyond expected reasoning. In the silence of his room, Malcolm felt an unfamiliar clarity. The humiliation had become the lens through which he could see patterns invisible to anyone else. Every line of the theorem seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if mathematics itself responded to the emotion he poured into it. Frustration transformed into elegance, anger into symmetry, and doubt into precise logic. Malcolm imagined the classroom watching him again, imagined Miss Whitmore's laughter, imagined her disbelief. He shivered, not from cold, but from the awareness that this equation, this theorem forming in his mind, was no longer a personal exercise. It was a statement, a confrontation, and an opportunity to expose the subtle biases hiding in plain sight. Hours passed without Malcolm noticing. He scribbled, erased, recalculated, and reimagined. The quiet energy of the night became a conduit for his thoughts. His fingers ached from holding the pencil too tightly, but he barely noticed he was consumed, driven, and mesmerized by the logic that unfolded before him. Every correction, every erased line, brought him closer to a revelation he hadn't yet fully anticipated, a discovery that transcended the original problem, hinting at principles broader than the classroom's narrow expectation. An unexpected twist jolted him, as he realized the scope of his theorem. In one of the recalculations, a connection emerged that no one could have predicted, a hidden symmetry embedded, not just in the problem he had solved, but in a broader mathematical system, one that suggested new relationships between variables previously thought unrelated. Malcolm paused, pencil hovering above the paper, his breath caught in his chest. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a solution to a single quiz, or a clever workaround. It could redefine an entire approach, expose assumptions that had been taken for granted, and most importantly, force Ms. Whitmore and anyone else who doubted him to confront the limitations of their biases. The thrill was intoxicating, but so was fear. He knew that the very act of discovery carried risk. If he shared the theorem too early, before refining it fully, he risked dismissal, ridicule, or accusations of overreaching. If he waited too long, someone else might notice, or worse, he might falter in explaining it under scrutiny. The balance between ambition and caution stretched taut, and Malcolm felt the emotional weight of the decision pressing against him. The stakes were no longer academic, they were deeply personal, tied to identity, perception, and the subtle injustices he had endured since childhood. Malcolm's mind drifted briefly to the classroom again, to the cruel laughter, the whispers, the judgmental glances. He remembered the sting of Miss Whitmore's comment, dismissing his correct answer as luck. That memory, once painful, now served as a compass, guiding each line, each calculation. Every variable he connected, every pattern he traced, became an assertion of capability, a refusal to let prejudice define his limits. The night stretched on, and with it, Malcolm's theorem took shape, becoming not just a solution, but a challenge, a puzzle no one could ignore without acknowledging the brilliance of its author. He paused occasionally to lean back and stare at the ceiling, letting the moonlight fall across the page. Ideas collided in his mind like sparks, connections forming across disciplines, revealing a depth to the theorem he hadn't anticipated. Each insight was exhilarating, yet anxiety accompanied it, a reminder that every revelation carried potential scrutiny, misunderstanding, or even sabotage. Malcolm had long internalized the ways society questioned his competence, the quiet but pervasive skepticism directed at a black boy navigating spaces, dominated by assumptions of inferiority. Here alone he wrestled with that tension and harnessed it, converting emotional pain into intellectual energy. Hours became minutes, minutes became seconds. Malcolm's pencil moved with purpose, tracing the final structures, calculating subtleties, adjusting coefficients, and balancing variables with meticulous care. The theorem began to shimmer with completeness, a lattice of logic so tight, so precise, that even he had to pause and marvel at the clarity emerging from the chaos. The intellectual excitement was intoxicating, but so was the awareness of what was at stake. Sharing this theorem could disrupt expectations, challenge authority, and confront biases embedded in the system. It was a risk, but one he could not ignore. At some point, Malcolm's parents crept quietly past his room, unaware of the storm of thought and emotion unfolding inside. They had always been supportive, nurturing a belief in his potential, while teaching him the harsh reality that the world would not always acknowledge his brilliance. Their encouragement echoed silently in his mind, a quiet affirmation that fortified his resolve. Every correction, every scoff, every moment of subtle dismissal became a stepping stone towards something greater. He was no longer solving equations. He was building proof of resilience, defiance, and unassailable intelligence. The night wore on, and Malcolm finally leaned back, exhausted yet exhilarated. His hand ached, eyes stung from strain, but on the page before him the theorem stood nearly complete. Every pattern aligned, every variable accounted for, and every connection revealed a logic that was elegant, undeniable, and powerful. The quiet triumph coursed through him, tempered by the knowledge that the true test was yet to come, revealing it to a world conditioned to dismiss, underestimate, or mock him. Then, in a startling twist, Malcolm noticed something subtle yet profound. The theorem contained a hidden simplification, a principle that could resolve other complex problems effortlessly. It was a discovery he had not expected, a hidden key that transformed the theorem from brilliance to revolutionary insight. The realization made his pulse quicken. What had started as a personal act of defiance was now something far greater, a theorem that could expose both intellectual and systemic blind spots in ways that no one could ignore. Malcolm's heart raced as he stared at the page, the theorem fully formed in his mind. It was elegant, it was powerful, and it was his. The humiliation of the classroom, the laughter, the whispers, the subtle doubts imposed by Whitmore and others, all of it had become the catalyst for an extraordinary creation. He felt a surge of quiet triumph, tempered by the anticipation of what was to come. This was more than mathematics. It was a statement, a challenge, a confrontation with a world that had too often refused to see him for who he truly was. As Malcolm traced the final line and held his pencil above the page, he realized the full scope of what he had created, a theorem so precise, so powerful that when revealed, it could not only prove his brilliance, but force Whitmore and the biases she represented to confront the undeniable truth. And somewhere far from his quiet room, the world was unknowingly about to witness a reckoning. The next morning, Eastbrook High's hallways buzzed, not with ordinary chatter but with an undercurrent of excitement, curiosity, and the faint tension of gossip spreading faster than wildfire. Students whispered in tight clusters, their eyes flicking toward Malcolm Carter as he walked past. At first he didn't understand. It wasn't until he reached his locker that he noticed the faint glow of notifications flooding his phone. Messages, likes, comments, shares. His screen was alive with activity unlike anything he had ever experienced. A short video had gone viral overnight. The footage captured room 214. The moment of Ms. Whitmore's mocking laughter, echoing through the classroom, as Malcolm correctly solved the quiz problem. The caption was blunt, almost cruel in its simplicity. Lucky guess? Or something else entirely. The video had already garnered thousands of views, circulating across social media platforms, shared by students, friends, and strangers alike. The reactions were polarized, some praising Malcolm's brilliance, others mocking him, framing his achievement as fluke or accident. Malcolm stared at the screen, his heart pounding. Recognition had arrived in a form he hadn't expected, one tangled with judgment, ridicule, and public scrutiny. His private humiliation, once confined to a single classroom, had now become a spectacle. He felt the subtle sting of exposure. Every laugh, every whisper from classmates replayed online for the world to witness. The boundary between celebration and exploitation blurred. He had wanted acknowledgement for his intellect, not viral attention that invited commentary from strangers who knew nothing of his effort, his struggle, or the subtle racism he had endured daily. Jordan appeared beside him, leaning against the locker with a wry, knowing expression. "Looks like the world got a sneak peek at what we already knew," he said, voice low. "But be careful, man. People love to celebrate brilliance, then tear it down when it doesn't fit the story they want to believe." Malcolm nodded silently, scrolling through the comments. The spectrum of reactions was dizzying. Some praised him as a prodigy, others dismissed him as lucky, while a few made cruel, racially charged remarks, framing his intelligence as an anomaly, a deviation from what they expected of a black teenager. The sting of bias, so familiar in classrooms and corridors, now carried the amplified weight of the public eye. He felt the tension coil inside him, anger and exhilaration mixed into a heady cocktail, every notification a reminder that recognition came at a price. By lunchtime, the video had sparked discussions across the school. Teachers whispered in staff rooms, students debated in hallways, and administrators convened quietly to assess the fallout. Malcolm tried to keep a low profile, but it was impossible. Everywhere he went, eyes followed, Voices muttered, and even well-meaning peers approached him with a mixture of awe and awkwardness. The classroom had expanded into a global audience, and Malcolm was at the center, unwillingly and unprepared. Despite the overwhelming attention, Malcolm returned to his sketches that evening. He spread his notebook across the desk, tracing the theorem that had begun to take shape. The lines, symbols, and patterns seemed almost alive under his pencil, each stroke a quiet act of defiance against the humiliation of the previous day. Social media attention buzzed in the background, but here in his room he could focus, undisturbed by the external chaos. Every pattern he traced, every calculation refined, felt like reclaiming a sense of agency that had been denied him in the classroom, turned into a public spectacle, and judged by an audience that knew nothing of the emotional labor behind the work. As the night deepened, Malcolm noticed something unexpected. One of the students who had filmed the viral clip had also posted images of his notebook sketches online. They were messy, preliminary, and incomplete, but unmistakably the foundation of his theorem. The images circulated rapidly, comments speculating about his potential, and brilliance multiplying by the minute. Malcolm's stomach twisted. He hadn't shared these publicly, hadn't sought to attract attention in this form, and now the most private, formative work of his intellectual life was exposed. Yet within the anxiety, a spark of possibility emerged. The exposure, unintended though it was, meant that Malcolm's work was reaching people far beyond Eastbrook High. Teachers in other districts, university students, amateur mathematicians, anyone with curiosity and knowledge, could see the raw potential embedded in his sketches. The realization thrilled and terrified him. Recognition, he now understood, was a double-edged sword. Publicity could amplify his intellect, but it could also invite scrutiny, skepticism, and prejudice in ways he had never imagined. Around midnight, Malcolm's phone buzzed with a notification that made him freeze. An unfamiliar email address, cryptically named, appeared in his inbox. Subject line: "Your theorem, a challenge worth exploring." Heart-hammering, he opened the message. The content was brief. "I've seen your sketches online. There is depth and originality here that cannot be ignored. If you are willing, I would like to discuss your approach further. Discretion guaranteed. This could change everything for you." Malcolm's breath caught. Who was this person? The tone was formal, precise, yet carried the weight of authority. His mind raced, imagining possibilities. Could it be a professor, a mathematician, someone influential enough to recognize talent and potentially open doors previously unimaginable? At the same time, caution crept in. Social media had already exposed him to scrutiny, and this mysterious message could be genuine, or it could be another test, a manipulation, an attempt to exploit the work he had created in private. He glanced at the notebook beside him, tracing the lines he had labored over through the night. The theorem had grown from a personal act of defiance into something with implications far beyond the walls of Eastbrook High. Recognition, humiliation, and opportunity were now intertwined, creating a tension that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Malcolm understood that responding to this email could be a pivotal moment, one that might catapult him into a world where his intellect would finally be taken seriously, or expose him to deeper bias and disappointment. Jordan's voice echoed in his memory. People love to celebrate brilliance, then tear it down when it doesn't fit the story they want to believe. Malcolm reflected on those words, realizing that the email was both an invitation and a test. His work, once confined to the margins of a high school classroom, was now a beacon, visible to people with power to recognize, challenge, or exploit it. The weight of potential success pressed against his chest, but he also felt the familiar fire of defiance burning quietly in his core. As he stared at the email, Malcolm's mind raced with scenarios. Could he trust this stranger? Could he navigate the delicate line between recognition and exploitation? The theorem itself demanded careful presentation, precision, and understanding that only he could provide. Sharing it prematurely could undermine years of meticulous thought. Yet remaining silent could squander an opportunity that had been denied to him repeatedly by biases, scorn, and systemic assumptions about intelligence and race. Unexpectedly, Malcolm realized that this cryptic message mirrored the paradox of his classroom experiences. Authority figures dismissing potential while simultaneously creating the conditions for brilliance to emerge. Whitmore's scoff had provoked him to refine his theorem. Now a mysterious mathematician's interest could provide the platform he had been denied. The irony was not lost on him, and he felt a thrill that mingled fear with exhilaration. He leaned back, fingers hovering over the keyboard, unsure whether to respond immediately or sleep on the decision. Outside, the moonlight reflected off his notebook, illuminating the careful lines and patterns that had consumed his nights. Every stroke, every variable, every symmetry was now more than a personal triumph. It was a beacon that could disrupt assumptions, challenge biases, and perhaps force those who had doubted him to reckon with a truth they had long ignored. As Malcolm typed the first tentative words of a response, his phone buzzed again with another notification. This time, it was a direct message from a stranger on social media, claiming to have insight into the hidden patterns in his theorem. The message was brief but unmistakably cryptic. "You don't yet see the full picture. What you've discovered is only the beginning." Malcolm froze, realizing that his private, painstaking work had opened a door to a challenge far larger and far more dangerous than he could have anticipated. Malcolm Carter sat on the edge of his bed, phone vibrating incessantly beside him, notifications piling up like unspoken demands. The viral video, the social media attention, the cryptic emails, it all created a pressure he hadn't anticipated. The quiet sanctuary of his room, once a haven for creativity and focus, now felt constricting, as if the walls themselves were pressing him to perform, to live up to expectations he hadn't yet fully defined for himself. Every glance at the screen brought a new wave of doubt, of scrutiny, a reminder that brilliance in a black teenager was often celebrated only conditionally, with skepticism lurking beneath every compliment. He leaned back, closing his eyes, trying to silence the buzzing of notifications. Jordan's words echoed in his mind. People love to celebrate brilliance, then tear it down when it doesn't fit the story they want to believe. Malcolm knew the truth in that statement. He had seen it repeatedly, teachers subtly undermining him, peers whispering doubts, systemic expectations that assumed failure before he even began. The thought that he might now be the target of similar judgment on a public stage intensified the anxiety, making his own achievements feel precarious. His parents, though supportive, had unknowingly added to the weight. Their pride was a double-edged sword, reminding him of potential yet instilling a quiet fear of failure. He recalled his father's calm voice from earlier. "Son, people will try to define you by their expectations, not your ability." Malcolm understood the lesson, but in this moment, the scale of expectation felt enormous. Could he really navigate a space where every success would be questioned, and every mistake amplified because of the assumptions attached to his race? The theorem he had been developing offered him a fragile lifeline. It was tangible, concrete, and undeniable, a piece of intellectual territory he could claim entirely as his own. Yet, the emotional toll was immediate. Every equation, every line, every proof carried the weight of representation. He wasn't just solving a problem anymore. He was proving repeatedly that a black student could excel in an environment subtly designed to suppress brilliance. The stakes were both mathematical and existential, entwined in ways he hadn't expected. Malcolm opened his notebook and stared at the half-formed theorem, tracing lines with a pencil, imagining its potential impact. There was a strange thrill in recognizing the depth and originality of his own work. But the doubt remained. What if others saw only the surface? What if Whitmore dismissed it publicly, or worse, framed it as luck, chance, or an anomaly? He knew she could subtly undermine his achievement, without ever saying the words aloud, a tactic he had already experienced in class. The possibility made him hesitate, fingers frozen above the paper. Jordan's text buzzed on his phone. "You've got this. Don't let them steal your story." Malcolm smiled faintly, but couldn't shake the tension. The thought of presenting his theorem in class filled him with simultaneous dread and exhilaration. He imagined the stares, the whispers, the judgmental glances from peers conditioned to question him, and he imagined Miss Whitmore's inevitable disbelief and skepticism. Yet beneath the fear, a spark of defiance flickered, reminding him that brilliance demanded risk. Malcolm spent hours that night revisiting every line of his theorem, erasing, redrawing, recalculating, testing each connection. The mental exhaustion was immense, but so was the exhilaration of creation. In the quiet of his room, with only the hum of the heater and the soft scrape of pencil on paper, he began to see patterns more clearly, subtleties that eluded others, relationships between variables that hinted at a larger principle. The theorem was no longer just a solution to a quiz. It is becoming a manifesto, a challenge to assumptions, and a quiet act of defiance. And then, unexpectedly, a realization hit him, a subtle connection he had overlooked. The theorem wasn't just elegant. It could be generalized, extended beyond the confines of the classroom problem, to reveal principles that others would find difficult to dispute. Malcolm froze, heart pounding. This was bigger than he had imagined. But so was the risk. Presenting it meant exposing himself to judgment, ridicule, and perhaps even hostility from a teacher who had already dismissed him and peers who might feel threatened by his success. The emotional complexity of the moment was overwhelming. Pride warred with fear, excitement collided with anxiety, and defiance emerged alongside doubt. Malcolm realized that this was the psychological crucible in which resilience was forged. Every microaggression, every dismissive glance, every subtle racialized assumption he had endured, now had the potential to transform into intellectual power, if he could only navigate the path forward without allowing fear to dominate. As the night deepened, Malcolm considered the potential fallout. The social media attention alone had already altered the landscape. People who had never met him were forming opinions based on a short clip, framing his success as fluke, anomaly, or curiosity. The scrutiny would only intensify if he revealed more of the theorem, if he allowed the depth of his insight to become public. Yet the possibility of remaining silent felt like a betrayal of his own talent, a concession to the systemic biases that had sought to contain him for years. In a sudden twist of clarity, Malcolm realized that the doubt he felt was precisely the mechanism of the injustice he sought to challenge. Bias worked by instilling hesitation, by making brilliance feel precarious, by linking success to chance rather than ability. And in that moment, Malcolm understood that the act of presenting his work, however risky, was itself an assertion, a refusal to internalize the limitations others tried to impose. It was not only an intellectual exercise, it was a moral one. The hours passed in a blur of calculation, self-reflection, and mental rehearsal. Malcolm imagined standing in front of the classroom, notebook in hand, eyes meeting Ms. Whitmore's skeptical gaze. He pictured the gasps of peers as they glimpsed the depth of the theorem, the murmurs of disbelief, the challenge to long-held assumptions. Every potential outcome carried weight, yet every line he traced strengthened his resolve. The theorem was more than a solution. It was an argument, a statement, a confrontation with both mathematical rigor and the prejudices that had shaped his world. By dawn, exhaustion had settled deep in his bones, but the clarity in his mind was undeniable. The theorem, now fully conceptualized, was ready to be shared. Not in fragments, not in secrecy, but as a deliberate presentation, a calculated risk to assert both intelligence and agency. Malcolm understood the stakes. Public exposure in class could either humiliate him, confirming the expectations of those who doubted him, or validate him, proving that brilliance could not be constrained by bias. The choice demanded courage, but also a recognition that silence was a concession he could no longer afford. He sat quietly for a moment, notebook closed, staring at the blank space of the desk before him. Fear still whispered doubts. What if Ms. Whitmore dismissed it? What if peers ridiculed him further? What if the theorem, despite its elegance, was misunderstood or misrepresented? Yet the spark of defiance flared brighter, reminding him that risk was inherent in every act of disruption, in every challenge to authority, and in every confrontation with systemic bias. Malcolm finally made his decision. The theorem would be revealed, at least in part, in class. The world would see a fraction of the brilliance he had nurtured in secret. The choice was both terrifying and exhilarating. A test not just of intellect, but of courage, of resilience, and of the refusal to let bias define the parameters of his potential. As Malcolm packed his notebook into his backpack, ready to face the classroom once again, he noticed an unfamiliar figure standing near the school entrance, watching him intently. The stranger's expression was unreadable, their presence silent but deliberate. Malcolm's stomach tightened as he realized that today, the theorem would not only challenge Ms. Whitmore and his peers, but perhaps someone far beyond the walls of Eastbrook High had also taken notice, waiting to see whether his brilliance would withstand scrutiny in ways he could not yet imagine. The morning air carried a tense anticipation as Malcolm Carter walked into room 212. The hum of fluorescent lights and the muted rustle of papers usually faded into the background for him, but today every sound seemed amplified. He carried his notebook carefully, every line of the theorem etched in careful detail, the weight of hours of solitary work pressing against the curve of the spiral binding. His heart thrummed with a combination of dread and exhilaration. He knew that what he was about to do was more than classwork. It was a test of courage, intellect, and the fragile boundaries imposed by bias. Mrs. Whitmore stood at the front of the classroom, arms crossed, the expression on her face perfectly neutral, Yet Malcolm felt its sharp edge. Her eyes, precise and assessing, swept across the room and landed briefly on him. He recognized that look, the subtle skepticism she reserved for him, as if his mere presence in the advanced calculus class were a test of her judgment rather than his ability. He clenched his jaw and took a deep breath, reminding himself that the theorem he had nurtured in Seckert was undeniable. It was not speculation. It was proof meticulously calculated, and it demanded acknowledgement. The teacher distributed a set of new problems for the day. Malcolm's eyes scanned the page but immediately diverted to the margins, where he had carefully annotated a related problem inspired by his own theorem. With deliberate care he began writing, tracing variables and testing connections, silently preparing to submit a piece of work that would challenge the assumptions of the room. Every line of ink became an assertion of competence, a quiet rebellion against the subtle dismissals he had endured for years. A few students glanced at him curiously, whispering to one another, their expressions a mix of skepticism and anticipation. They had watched the viral video, seen the social media chatter, and were now trying to reconcile their preconceived notions with the possibility that Malcolm's brilliance was genuine. The weight of expectation pressed on him, but he let it fuel precision rather than fear. When he placed his notebook on Ms. Whitmore's desk, he noticed her glance flicker briefly toward him, a subtle narrowing of her eyes. She opened the pages, scanning the equations casually at first, her expression a mask of neutrality. "Interesting attempt," she said aloud, her tone neutral but edged with skepticism. "Let's see if it makes sense." The words were innocuous, but the subtle condescension was unmistakable. Malcolm swallowed, feeling the familiar sting of dismissal, yet he remained calm. This was exactly what he had anticipated, the moment where bias attempted to overshadow clarity. As Miss Whitmore began reviewing the calculations, a subtle tension fell over the classroom. Students sensed something unusual. They noticed her pause, the way her eyes lingered longer than typical on the notation, the slight tilt of her head as if recalculating her own assumptions. Malcolm's pen hovered above the page, tracing the final connections quietly in his notebook, confident in the logic he had painstakingly constructed. The theorem, now partially formalized, began to reveal a principle that extended beyond the immediate problem, a solution that challenged standard assumptions and required rigorous attention to detail. Unexpectedly, Miss Whitmore frowned, a rare, subtle break in her composed demeanor. "Wait," she murmured, almost to herself. Her voice carried faint disbelief, the tone revealing a crack in her usually unshakable authority. She adjusted her glasses and leaned closer, tracing the logic of Malcolm's work. Each line she followed revealed precision, elegance, and a depth of understanding that she could not easily dismiss. The classroom remained quiet, though students were acutely aware of the shift. Something in the room had changed. The air felt charged with an unspoken anticipation, as if the very walls recognized a subtle upheaval. Malcolm felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. He had anticipated skepticism, even dismissal, but the gradual recognition of the depth of his theorem was exhilarating. Yet he remained cautious. He knew Whitmore's subtle biases could reassert themselves, framing brilliance as luck or coincidence. Still, each calculated step he presented was undeniable. The mathematics, clear and rigorous, could not be reduced to opinion. As the minutes passed, Ms. Whitmore's gaze shifted, flicking between the notebook and Malcolm. She began questioning certain assumptions aloud, her voice carefully measured, but with an edge of incredulity. The precision of the theorem defied her expectations. It was more than a clever solution. It revealed connections that challenged conventional methods. Her laughter, previously a tool of dismissal, faltered, leaving an uncharacteristic silence in the room. Students leaned forward in their seats, sensing the tension, the subtle shift from condescension to astonishment. Malcolm's pulse quickened. This was the moment he had prepared for, yet the stakes were higher than he had imagined. Every gaze in the room carried judgment, expectation, and curiosity. He felt the pressure of representation, the knowledge that his brilliance was not just personal but symbolic, carrying the weight of unspoken assumptions about who could succeed in spaces like this. He traced the final connections in the problem, finishing the calculations with deliberate precision, ensuring that each line was beyond reproach. Then came a twist he had not anticipated. A student at the back of the classroom, previously skeptical, whispered a comment about the elegance of the solution, an acknowledgement that was both unexpected and startling. This subtle recognition rippled through the room, challenging peer assumptions, while Ms. Whitmore's attention remained fixed on the notebook. The authority figure who had dismissed him was now confronted with undeniable evidence. The intelligence she had unconsciously underestimated could not be ignored. The room fell into an unusual quiet. Students exchanged glances, some wide-eyed, others tentative, as if realizing they had underestimated Malcolm's capabilities. The air was thick with anticipation and disbelief. Ms. Whitmore, normally composed and quick to dismiss, now hesitated, her expression a mixture of astonishment and reluctant respect. The theorem, elegant and rigorous, was exposing the implicit biases that had subtly shaped her judgment. Malcolm felt a surge of quiet satisfaction, tempered by awareness of the fragility of the moment. This was not triumph yet. Acknowledgement could be fleeting, and the subtle racial and intellectual biases in the room could resurface at any moment. He remained poised, allowing the theorem to speak for itself, while the classroom absorbed the disruption of expectation. Every calculated stroke, every line of reasoning, became both proof and protest. And then, just as Ms. Whitmore seemed poised to respond, an unexpected development occurred. A notification buzzed on Malcolm's phone, its screen lighting up with an alert. One of his theorem sketches had been reposted online, gaining traction in mathematics forums. The world beyond the classroom was now watching, and the tension in the room multiplied exponentially. Recognition was no longer confined to Eastbrook High. It was being amplified by an audience that could neither ignore nor diminish the intellectual statement he was presenting. The classroom fell silent, sensing the revelation unfolding before them, as Malcolm realized that the theorem he had nurtured in secret was now not only challenging Ms. Whitmore's assumptions, but poised to disrupt expectations far beyond the walls of room 214. And for the first time, Ms. Whitmore's dismissive laughter faltered, leaving a crack in her authority that no one in the room could ignore. After the commotion of class, Malcolm Carter retreated to the quiet sanctuary of his room, the glow of his desk lamp casting a warm circle of light on the scattered papers, notebooks, and scribbled equations that chronicled the journey of his theorem. Unlike the sterile whiteboard in room 214, these pages carried the weight of discovery, of frustration, of countless nights spent wrestling with patterns that only he seemed to perceive. He traced lines again and again, marveling at the hidden symmetries, the elegant connections that had begun to emerge from what had once been chaos. The theorem, which had started as a simple response to a classroom problem, now revealed a complexity he hadn't fully anticipated. Patterns nested within patterns, sequences mirroring each other in ways that suggested a deeper order to the mathematical universe. Malcolm felt a thrill, a mixture of awe and satisfaction, at the realization that he had glimpsed something profound. Each variable, each coefficient, was not just a number, it was part of a living structure, a hidden choreography of logic and creativity. Yet amid this exhilaration was an undercurrent of tension. The classroom's recognition of his brilliance, tempered by skepticism and subtle disbelief, had only highlighted the systemic biases that had always surrounded him. Malcolm understood that his intellectual achievements existed in a space charged with expectations, both overt and unspoken. Authority figures like Ms. Whitmore often framed his success as anomaly or fluke, and peers oscillated between curiosity, admiration, and doubt. He had to navigate this carefully, aware that every visible achievement was now loaded with implications far beyond personal accomplishment. That evening, as he revisited the theorem, Malcolm noticed a layer of subtlety he had not accounted for. A series of secondary relationships within the problem hinted at broader implications, connections that could simplify other complex equations in ways previously thought impossible. His mind raced, exhilarated and nervous at once. This was more than clever insight. It was a principle, a reflection of a larger intellectual truth. He realized that the patterns were not confined to one problem. They hinted at a new way of thinking, a perspective that could challenge assumptions embedded in academic structures. Malcolm paused, pen hovering above the paper, a mixture of pride and apprehension coursing through him. The elegance of the theorem was undeniable, yet the very brilliance that made it beautiful also made it dangerous. In a system that had long underestimated him, acknowledging this depth would force others to confront their biases. Every subtle dismissal, every unspoken judgment, every microaggression he had endured for years, suddenly became relevant, casting the theorem not just as an intellectual triumph, but as an act of quiet rebellion. The unexpected twist came when he noticed a secondary connection within the equations that had gone unnoticed even in class. A hidden relationship between variables suggested that the theorem could extend beyond its intended scope, linking problems that had been considered unrelated. Malcolm felt a jolt of exhilaration mixed with fear. If this discovery were revealed, it could fundamentally alter the way his classmates, and even his teacher, understood the subject. Yet the potential backlash, subtle as it might be, loomed like a shadow. Recognition was no longer enough. The theorem had become a challenge, a provocation, a mirror reflecting the prejudices it sought to disrupt. Malcolm leaned back, eyes closed, feeling the tension of the day and the weight of expectation pressing against him. His mind replayed the moments in room 214, the skeptical glances, the whispers, Ms. Whitmore's initial laughter. Each memory reminded him of the precariousness of his position, of the fine line between brilliance and social scrutiny in a world that often judged potential through the lens of race. He knew that the hidden patterns he was uncovering were more than academic. They were statements, symbols of resilience against a system that had always questioned him. Late into the night, he refined the theorem further, connecting threads, testing assumptions, ensuring that every line was precise, elegant, and irrefutable. Each calculation was meticulous, deliberate, and charged with emotion. He traced sequences that mirrored one another, identified symmetries that spoke of an unseen order, and mapped relationships that even seasoned mathematicians might overlook. The intellectual joy was intertwined with an emotional undercurrent, a sense of defiance, pride, and vindication that surged with every correct line of reasoning. While Malcolm worked, the wider implications of his theorem began to crystallize. Beyond the classroom, beyond social media attention, beyond viral videos and cryptic emails, his work had the power to challenge established assumptions. He imagined peers attempting to reproduce his logic, authority figures recalculating expectations, and skeptics confronted with undeniable proof. The realization both thrilled and terrified him. Recognition could validate years of struggle, yet the exposure of hidden brilliance could also provoke resistance, subtle undermining, and the reinforcement of biases he had fought so hard to navigate. An unexpected layer emerged when he considered the social dimension of his theorem. The patterns he had uncovered were elegant, not only mathematically, but philosophically. Each connection reflected principles of persistence, observation, and creativity that mirrored his own journey. Years of subtle dismissal, microaggressions, and underestimation. In a strange sense, the theorem became autobiographical, a coded narrative of a black teenager, navigating an environment laden with unspoken prejudice. It was a mathematical testament to resilience, a silent statement embedded in logic and symmetry, waiting to be recognized. Meanwhile, Ms. Whitmore's own curiosity had begun to shift. The teacher, normally so composed and authoritative, found herself revisiting Malcolm's work late into the night after the initial class demonstration. Alone in her office, she meticulously double-checked his calculations, tracing lines with a pencil, comparing coefficients, and following logic that at first seemed almost too precise, too elegant, to be the work of a student she had quietly underestimated. The unexpected twist came when she discovered a subtle secondary proof embedded within his theorem, an insight so refined it could potentially redefine the approach to the lesson plan she had carefully constructed. Ms. Whitmore's reaction was silent, but electric. Her initial disbelief gave way to a cautious acknowledgement of the theorem's brilliance. The realization unsettled her. The evidence challenged not only her expectations of Malcolm, but also the assumptions she had unconsciously carried as a teacher. Here was a student she had subtly dismissed, now producing work that rivaled and even extended her own professional understanding. The intellectual confrontation was unexpected, uncomfortable, and undeniable. Back in his room, Malcolm sensed the unspoken weight of the discovery he had made. The hidden patterns in his theorem were more than intellectual triumph. They were an implicit challenge to authority, a confrontation with subtle racial bias, and a testament to his own resilience. Each connection, each symmetry, each variable was a quiet assertion that brilliance could not be contained by doubt, prejudice, or the faint scoffs of those who sought to undermine it. The night stretched on, the quiet of his room punctuated by the occasional scribble, a low sigh of contemplation, and the hum of the heater. Malcolm's theorem had grown from a solution to a classroom problem into a framework with implications far beyond the immediate context. He realized the patterns he had uncovered were not only mathematically elegant, but socially and emotionally resonant, a reflection of his journey through subtle injustice, ridicule, and underestimation. Unbeknownst to Malcolm, Ms. Whitmore remained at her desk in the darkened classroom, notebook in hand, tracing the lines of his theorem in secret. She discovered the subtle secondary proof that could not only redefine her lesson plan, but also expose the biases she had unconsciously harbored. The realization left her uneasy, her authority quietly shaken, and Malcolm's work poised to challenge not just the classroom, but the very assumptions of those who had underestimated him. The day of the statewide math competition arrived, with a crisp chill in the air, the kind of October morning that made Eastbrook streets shimmer faintly with frost. Malcolm Carter walked into the auditorium, his notebook clutched tightly, the weight of weeks of work pressing against his back and shoulders. The venue was grand, a testament to achievement, lined with banners celebrating excellence in mathematics, buzzing with students, teachers, and parents from across the state. Yet amidst the excitement, Malcolm felt the familiar tension of scrutiny, the weight of expectation that came with being the black teenager whose recent viral attention had drawn whispers before he had even spoken. Judges, dressed in conservative suits, their expressions neutral but eyes sharp, sat at long tables at the front of the room. Their reputation preceded them. These were men and women who had long prided themselves on objective evaluation. Yet Malcolm could feel the subtle undertones of doubt directed his way. Some glanced at him with polite curiosity, others with thinly veiled skepticism. He noticed the brief flicker of surprise when he took his seat, the quiet calculation of someone reassessing expectations even before the competition began. The first round proceeded with routine problems. Students scribbling furiously, calculators clicking, quiet murmurs filling the space. Malcolm's focus, however, was elsewhere. He traced patterns in his notebook, refining the theorem he had nurtured in secret, rehearsing the presentation of its elegant logic. He knew the scrutiny would be intense. The judges had already heard of his viral moment, and he could sense their caution, the underlying expectation that brilliance from a black teenager might be coincidental or exaggerated. It was not overt, but it was unmistakable to someone who had grown attuned to the nuances of bias. When it was his turn, Malcolm approached the podium, notebook in hand, aware of the low hum of conversation around him. Whispers rose, some admiring, some skeptical, some questioning whether he belonged on this stage. The audience's attention pressed on him in waves. He began explaining the theorem, carefully walking through the logic, revealing patterns that extended beyond the original classroom problem. His voice was steady, measured, yet carried the weight of years of subtle dismissal and doubt. Each line of reasoning was deliberate, precise, intended to leave no space for misinterpretation. The judges listened with varying degrees of interest. One, a tall man with wire-rimmed glasses, furrowed his brow, muttering under his breath about assumptions. Another leaned back, arms crossed, exchanging a glance with a colleague that Malcolm interpreted as cautious disbelief. He could almost hear the silent question in the air: is this truly a product of understanding, or just another lucky calculation? The room was hostile in its skepticism, a subtle but palpable pressure that reminded Malcolm that his race would color every judgment, however hidden. Halfway through his explanation, a faint ripple of astonishment passed through the audience. His logic, elegant and interconnected, revealed patterns that were impossible to ignore. Variables interacted in ways that defied conventional expectations, symmetry and coherence emerging from what had appeared to be chaos. Yet the tension persisted. Even as some students whispered admiration, a few judges leaned back, murmuring about potential flaws, hesitating to acknowledge brilliance that challenged their assumptions. The room's air was thick with quiet conflict, recognition battling bias, validation constrained by expectation. Then came the moment that nearly unseated him. One judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, paused, tapping a pen against the table. "Your work is impressive," she began, her tone carefully neutral. "But there appears to be a potential flaw in your assumptions here. Have you considered how variable X might interact with coefficient Y under certain boundary conditions?" Her question was subtle, polite on the surface, yet laced with a hint of doubt that could easily destabilize confidence. Malcolm felt a tightness in his chest, the familiar weight of skepticism amplified by the stakes of the competition. Panic threatened to creep in. He could feel the whisper of self-doubt, the shadows of prior humiliation, and the ingrained fear of being underestimated. The audience waited, attentive yet judgmental, their collective gaze a reminder that he was navigating both intellect and bias simultaneously. Every student had faced challenge here, but few carried the invisible burden of being both brilliant and underestimated because of the color of their skin. Malcolm's mind raced, testing scenarios, recalculating logic, trying to anticipate every potential criticism. But then, amidst the rising tension, a spark of insight flared. Malcolm's eyes moved along the notebook, scanning the equations with practiced precision, and he noticed a subtle pattern that none of the judges had identified. A secondary relationship between variables, hidden in the structure of the theorem, provided a natural resolution to the hypothetical flaw the judge had suggested. It was elegant, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable to someone who had constructed the logic themselves. The realization hit him like a jolt. The very critique designed to destabilize him had revealed an even deeper layer of understanding. With deliberate calm, he traced the connection aloud, carefully explaining how the secondary relationship resolved the potential issue. His voice remained steady, confident, and precise, articulating logic that was undeniable. The room fell into a sudden, charged silence. The judge who had questioned him paused, eyebrows raised, lips pursed in a gesture of reluctant acknowledgement. Malcolm could feel the collective shift in attention, a subtle recalibration of assumptions, as recognition began to pierce the skepticism that had dominated the room. Unexpectedly, a murmur spread among a few students in the audience. They were not just impressed, they were unsettled by the elegance and depth of his insight. The theorem's hidden patterns had exposed a level of reasoning that disrupted conventional expectations, forcing acknowledgement not only of the solution, but of the brilliance behind it. Malcolm's pulse quickened, a mixture of exhilaration and fear, as he realized the theorem was performing exactly as he had intended, asserting intellectual authority in a space that had long doubted him. Yet the stakes were far from resolved. Some judges continued to exchange quiet, skeptical glances, their surprise tempered by reluctance to fully validate the work of a student who defied their expectations. Malcolm recognized the lingering tension, the invisible pressure to conform to societal assumptions, and felt the weight of representing not only himself but the larger reality of underestimated black brilliance. Every word, every explanation, became a delicate negotiation between logic, perception, and bias. As he concluded the formal presentation, Malcolm placed the notebook gently on the podium, heart hammering with both exhaustion and triumph. Applause rippled across the room, tentative yet genuine, mixed with whispers of skepticism that had yet to dissipate. The judges conferred quietly among themselves, the atmosphere tense, as if they were reconciling the undeniable mathematics with the expectations they had held for him. Malcolm's mind remained alert, processing the subtle shifts, the murmurs, the reassessment of authority that was taking place before him. Just as he began to relax, feeling a tentative sense of validation, the same judge who had questioned his work leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "There may be another consideration you've overlooked," she said softly, almost under her breath, her tone suggesting that even this brilliant resolution might not be enough. Malcolm froze, chest tightening, realizing that the flaw she hinted at could push him to the edge of despair. But then, in a sudden flash of clarity, his eyes caught the hidden connection in the theorem that no one else had noticed yet. This unseen pattern, subtle and elegant, could turn skepticism into undeniable proof, but only if he acted quickly and precisely. The auditorium hummed with subdued anticipation, as Malcolm Carter's eyes scanned the equations before him. The tension was palpable, an almost tangible weight pressing from the audience, the judges and the peers around him. He could feel it, a collective skepticism that had lingered since the moment he first stepped onto the stage. His theorem, nurtured in secrecy through countless nights of calculations and silent determination, was now fully exposed, vulnerable to judgment, critique, and the subtle prejudices he had long internalized. Malcolm's heart raced as he retraced the lines of his proof, each step deliberate, each connection precise. The hint of a flaw suggested by the judge in the previous round had jolted him, threatening to unseat the fragile confidence he had painstakingly cultivated. Yet amid the panic, a sudden insight struck. A secondary pattern, hidden within the relationships between variables, revealed itself with a clarity that was almost startling. It was a subtle symmetry, invisible to all who had examined the theorem casually, but unmistakable to him, the architect of the logic. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Malcolm traced the lines in his notebook, his pencil trembling slightly, as the realization solidified. The supposed flaw no longer posed a threat. Instead, it illuminated the hidden depth of the theorem. What had been presented as a challenge by authority, a judge who, like many before, had underestimated him, was now a gateway to undeniable proof. His mind raced, connecting threads, imagining the reactions in the room if he revealed this hidden layer, aware that it was more than a solution, it was a vindication. Malcolm took a deep breath, feeling a surge of exhilaration and fear simultaneously. The auditorium seemed to quiet around him, the murmurs fading, as he prepared to articulate the hidden pattern. He explained the additional relationship step by step, demonstrating how the secondary connections resolved the issue the judge had raised while simultaneously expanding the theorem's implications. The logic was flawless, elegant, and undeniably powerful, revealing a layer of complexity that no adult had noticed before. A murmur ran through the audience. Students exchanged glances, their skepticism faltering, curiosity and awe replacing the whispers of doubt. Even the judges leaned forward, pens poised, eyes narrowing as they traced the calculations. The theorem was no longer merely correct. It was transformative. Its hidden symmetry, revealed in precise detail, illuminated a depth that disrupted prior assumptions and forced acknowledgement of Malcolm's intellectual authority. For Malcolm, the moment was both triumphant and bitterly poignant. Every line he traced carried the weight of years of subtle dismissal, microaggressions, and unspoken assumptions about his capabilities. The laughter, the whispers, and the smirks he had endured for years, the very forces that had sought to undermine him, now amplified the significance of this breakthrough. His brilliance, previously questioned, was undeniable, yet the victory was tinged with the realization that the world often required extraordinary proof from someone like him, simply to be seen as capable. The judges began conferring quietly among themselves, the expressions on their faces a mixture of astonishment and cautious acknowledgement. Malcolm's theorem had shifted the dynamic in the room. What had once been a contest of evaluation was now an exposition of insight, a display of intellectual depth that challenged both peers and authority figures alike. He could sense the subtle recalibration of expectations, the quiet reassessment of what a black teenager could achieve when given the opportunity to explore, think and create, without bias. Unexpectedly, one of the judges, a stern man with thin-framed glasses, leaned back and muttered under his breath, This changes everything." The words, though not directed at him, reverberated with immense significance. Malcolm's pulse quickened. Every silent judgment, every subtle dismissal, every expectation of inadequacy was being overturned by evidence, by logic, by precision, by his unassailable understanding of the theorem. The room's energy shifted from doubt to recognition, but the acknowledgement was tinged with the quiet discomfort of those confronting biases long held. Yet the breakthrough brought no immediate relief. Malcolm remained acutely aware of the latent tension in the air. Recognition carried its own burden. The more undeniable his genius became, the more those invested in preconceived narratives of limitation struggled to reconcile the evidence with their expectations. Every impressed glance, every tentative nod was tempered by the undercurrent of disbelief, a subtle, almost imperceptible reminder that acknowledgement could be reluctant and incomplete. As he concluded the explanation, Malcolm felt a mix of triumph and vulnerability. His theorem, once a private triumph forged in isolation, was now public, indisputable, and impossible to ignore. He could almost hear the echoes of Whitmore's earlier dismissive laughter in the back of his mind, a faint, bitter resonance now overshadowed by the undeniable evidence of brilliance. The auditorium had become a stage not just for mathematics, but for the unspoken confrontation of bias, a proving ground that demanded recognition of talent regardless of race. Then came the unexpected twist. A student, previously skeptical, tentatively raised a hand, pointing out a possible extension of Malcolm's theorem. The idea was subtle, nuanced, yet its origin, sparked by Malcolm's work, showed that the hidden pattern had not only validated his own solution, but inspired critical thinking in others. Recognition was no longer unilateral. His intellectual influence began to ripple, forcing peers and authority figures alike to reconsider assumptions and recalibrate judgments. Malcolm's pulse quickened, a mixture of pride and cautious anticipation swelling within him. In the silence that followed, Malcolm realized the emotional magnitude of the moment. Years of microaggressions, years of being underestimated, had culminated in a single cinematic instant, a breakthrough that challenged assumptions, disrupted expectations, and demonstrated that brilliance could not be contained by subtle prejudice. The theorem was no longer simply a solution. It was a testament to resilience, intellectual courage, and the quiet power of persistence under scrutiny. And yet, even amid triumph, tension remained. Malcolm could feel the undercurrent of discomfort in Miss Whitmore, who had observed the unfolding of the theorem with the same precision as the judges. Her initial skepticism, rooted in subtle bias, had been dismantled by logic she could not ignore. Recognition of his brilliance now forced her to confront assumptions she had unconsciously relied upon, threatening the careful balance of authority she had maintained in the classroom. Malcolm's eyes briefly flicked to her. For the first time, she appeared uncertain, her usual composure fractured by the undeniable clarity of the work in front of her. The teacher who had dismissed him, whose laughter had once crushed his confidence, was now forced to reconcile her authority with the evidence before her. In that fleeting moment, Malcolm understood the stakes were not just intellectual, they were profoundly personal and social, reflecting the systemic dynamics he had navigated his entire academic life. The auditorium remained suspended in awe. The collective breath of students, peers and judges held in recognition of a moment that transcended ordinary achievement. Malcolm felt a quiet satisfaction, tempered by the lingering awareness that validation in a biased system often came at the cost of exposure and scrutiny. Yet for the first time the proof was undeniable, elegant, and fully his own. As Malcolm stepped back from the podium, the subtle tension thickened. Ms. Whitmore, notebook in hand, lingered near the edge of the auditorium, her eyes scanning the theorem one final time. Slowly, with a hesitation that spoke volumes, she realized that acknowledging Malcolm's hidden pattern could publicly undermine her authority, exposing the bias she had unconsciously carried. Malcolm, unaware of the silent reckoning unfolding behind him, felt the exhilaration of triumph, but a shadow of uncertainty hinted that the challenges of recognition were far from over. The classroom was nearly empty, the late afternoon sunlight filtering through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Malcolm Carter remained at his desk, notebook open, the theorem spread before him in meticulous detail. Every line, every connection, every hidden pattern reflected, not just intellect, but hours of quiet determination, resilience, and defiance against subtle dismissal. He felt a tension in the room, as palpable as the heat of the sun, anticipation mixed with anxiety. As Whitmore entered, her steps measured, her gaze sharp, she paused near the front, notebook clutched tightly, her usual authoritative composure tinged with an unfamiliar hesitation. The auditorium-like classroom, which had once echoed with her laughter at his earlier lucky guesses, now felt charged with an unspoken confrontation. Malcolm looked up from his work, steady and calm, but aware of the subtle weight of scrutiny in her eyes. Their previous encounters, the scoffs, the microaggressions, the dismissals, had culminated in this moment, a silent reckoning between intellect and ego. Ms. Whitmore's voice broke the silence, soft yet commanding. "Malcolm, I've been reviewing your work again," she said, her tone betraying an almost imperceptible tension. "I have to admit, there are layers here I didn't anticipate." Her words were carefully measured, but Malcolm felt the unspoken implication, acknowledgement mixed with discomfort. The teacher, who had long dismissed him with ease, was now facing the undeniable evidence of brilliance she could not contain. Malcolm met her gaze evenly, careful not to betray his own mixture of pride and caution. "I've made sure everything is consistent," he said quietly, "and the theorem can stand on its own. It doesn't need embellishment." There was no arrogance in his tone, only clarity, a measured insistence that the work itself carried authority beyond personal validation. The subtle insistence in his voice was a challenge, an assertion that recognition could not be dictated by ego or prejudice. Miss Whitmore moved closer, her eyes scanning the detailed proof again, lingering on the hidden pattern that had escaped her initial review. A flush of frustration flickered across her features, almost imperceptible, as she grappled with the reality. The student she had unconsciously underestimated had produced work of undeniable sophistication. Her ego, tied to authority and control, wrestled with the unavoidable truth. To acknowledge his brilliance fully would require confronting her own biases, a confrontation more personal and uncomfortable than any classroom critique. She paused, a rare moment of vulnerability seeping through her carefully maintained composure. "Malcolm, I must admit, this is impressive," she said slowly, "but I need to understand it fully. Could you explain how you arrived at this particular pattern? It seems unusual." The subtle tension in her voice reflected both genuine curiosity and a hint of defensive instinct. She had spent years teaching, assuming control over knowledge, only to find that her student had quietly redefined the boundaries of understanding within her own classroom. Malcolm's expression remained calm, but inside, a surge of satisfaction mingled with caution. He could sense the struggle in her posture, the internal negotiation between acknowledgement and the weight of bias. He carefully traced the connections aloud, walking her through each step of logic, each variable, each hidden symmetry. The room felt charged, the air thick with the unspoken weight of confrontation, where intellect and identity collided quietly, yet intensely. As he explained, an unexpected shift occurred. Miss Whitmore's initial defensiveness softened slightly, replaced by a grudging respect. The realization of the theorem's depth and elegance forced her to reconcile with the fact that Malcolm's intellect could not be ignored. Yet even as recognition emerged, a subtle tension lingered. Acknowledgement threatened her authority, challenging not just professional judgment, but the quiet assumptions that had shaped her perception of students. Malcolm noticed the faint struggle in her expression and chose his next words carefully. This theorem doesn't require special treatment, Miss Whitmore. It stands on its own merit. The logic, the patterns, they're all here. You don't need to overstate anything. The quiet firmness of his statement was a deliberate assertion of independence, an insistence that brilliance should be acknowledged without condescension or preferential treatment. The subtlety of his defiance, combined with intellectual precision, left her momentarily speechless. A twist unfolded in that silence. As she leaned closer to re-examine a particularly intricate section, Miss Whitmore realized that one of the hidden patterns he had employed could, if fully articulated, disrupt the structure of her planned lesson, even challenge methods she had taught for years without questioning. The revelation was subtle but undeniable. Malcolm's theorem was not just a personal triumph. It held implications that extended beyond the classroom, quietly exposing assumptions embedded in established practices. The weight of this realization was visible in her posture, in the slight tightening of her jaw, in the way her eyes lingered on his calculations. Recognition had arrived, but it came with discomfort, the confrontation of authority, and the implicit acknowledgement of bias she had long carried unconsciously. The intellectual and emotional stakes were intertwined, as powerful as the theorems themselves. Malcolm understood the tension perfectly. This was a rare moment where intellect forced an authority figure to face both the brilliance of a student and the limitations of her own perspective. She spoke again, her voice lower, almost hesitant. Malcolm, I see it now. The connections, the patterns, everything. It's more sophisticated than I realized. There was no laughter this time, no condescension, only the raw acknowledgement that she had misjudged him. Yet the subtle tension persisted. To fully embrace the recognition of his work meant accepting the unspoken truth of her bias, an uncomfortable confrontation with both intellect and identity. Malcolm remained composed, letting her process the implications. He did not press for praise. He did not demand acknowledgement. The theorem, he knew, was sufficient. Its elegance, precision, and undeniable logic spoke louder than any words could. He had long understood that validation from authority was optional, not essential, and that the proof itself carried its own authority. His calm defiance, paired with the theorem's brilliance, subtly shifted the balance in the room, leaving Whitmore to reconcile the tension between ego, recognition, and truth. The silence between them was heavy, charged with meaning. Malcolm's measured restraint contrasted with the teacher's internal struggle, an unspoken battle of intellect and ego. Every gesture, every glance, every pause spoke volume. Here, in the quiet aftermath of revelation, the confrontation was complete, not in confrontation of words, but in the collision of undeniable brilliance with subtle bias. At last, Malcolm closed his notebook, meeting Ms. Whitmore's gaze with quiet certainty. The theorem speaks for itself, he said, his voice steady, leaving no room for special treatment, no space for dismissal. Whitmore's eyes widened slightly as she realized the implications. Acknowledging the work fully could challenge her authority publicly, while denying it would betray both logic and integrity. Malcolm's quiet assertion left her trapped between bias and truth, and for the first time the teacher who had dismissed him had no easy answer. By the following week, Malcolm Carter's theorem had begun to circulate far beyond the walls of Eastbrook High. What had started as a private solution to a classroom problem, and then a quietly contested revelation in a statewide competition, now spread like wildfire through academic circles online. Posts in math forums, shared images of his carefully structured sketches, and annotations dissected by peers and amateur mathematicians alike, began to gain traction. The recognition he had long sought, though never in this form, arrived in waves of notifications and mentions, transforming the private triumph into public spectacle. Malcolm sat at his desk, staring at his laptop screen, a mixture of exhilaration and anxiety coursing through him. The theorem, once nurtured in the quiet hours of the night, was now being dissected by strangers, scholars, students, and professionals alike. Some lauded it as groundbreaking, praising the elegance of its hidden patterns and the subtle brilliance of its construction. Others scrutinized every line, looking for weaknesses, potential oversights, or anomalies. It was recognition on a scale he had never anticipated, and it was intoxicating, terrifying, and heavy all at once. Jordan appeared after school, leaning casually against Malcolm's doorway. "Dude, I think you've broken the internet, for math nerds," he said with a grin. eyes flicking toward the stream of notifications on the laptop. People are talking about your theorem everywhere. You're getting attention you didn't even ask for. Malcolm's fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure whether to respond to the deluge of messages, emails, and forum posts. I just wanted to prove I could solve it, he admitted quietly, voice tight with both pride and tension. I didn't expect this. The sheer scale of attention was overwhelming. The emotional weight of validation mingled with anxiety over scrutiny, bias, and judgment. The strange twist of public recognition was that it brought both acclaim and tension. Some teachers reached out privately, acknowledging the brilliance of his theorem, but there was always a hesitation, a subtle attempt to qualify their praise. Phrases like impressive for a high school student, or surprisingly elegant, reminded Malcolm that recognition came filtered through layers of expectation. And for a black student, acknowledgement often carried the burden of proving not only competence but the legitimacy of presence. Even Ms. Whitmore, once dismissive, had begun reaching out with quiet inquiries. Her emails were careful, measured, balancing professionalism with hints of respect she had rarely shown before. Malcolm read them with a mixture of satisfaction and cautious weariness. The recognition of his work was gratifying, but he remained acutely aware that validation in a biased system was never neutral. It came with subtle negotiation, both emotional and intellectual. The public nature of attention brought unexpected scrutiny. Discussions online often revolved around the novelty of the hidden patterns, the elegance of the theorem, and more disturbingly, the assumptions Malcolm had defied. There was astonishment, yes, but also disbelief, as some commenters framed his work as an anomaly, a fluke or a lucky stroke. The line between celebration and condescension blurred, highlighting the systemic prejudices he had long experienced firsthand. One evening, Malcolm received a private message from a young mathematics graduate student. I've been reviewing your sketches, the message read. The hidden symmetry in variable sets x and y. You've done something remarkable. I want to collaborate. If you're willing, you could really push this further. The overtures of mentorship were thrilling, yet carried a subtle weight. His private intellectual labor was now public property, open to both collaboration and critique, to recognition and potential exploitation. As the theorem continued to gain traction, a subtle tension developed among his peers. Some classmates previously dismissive now approached him with overt curiosity and thinly veiled attempts at flattery. Others, however, whispered behind closed doors, plotting subtle ways to undermine him. The attention he had once craved now became a double-edged sword, mixing pride and validation with anxiety over who might try to challenge or discredit him. Malcolm's pride swelled as he scrolled through online posts praising his brilliance. But the tension never fully lifted. Every positive comment, every mention of his theorem, carried the unspoken caveat that achievement in a black student often needed verification, justification, or replication to be considered legitimate. The emotional weight of being constantly measured against expectation and bias persisted, mingling with the joy of recognition to create a complicated mixture of elation and vigilance. Unexpectedly, the scrutiny took on a more personal dimension when a few students from his school began plotting to question the originality of his theorem. Quiet comments, half-formed suggestions, and subtle insinuations began circulating in whispered conversations. Did he really come up with that on his own? And I heard someone helped him. The whispers, initially faint, gained momentum, threatening to undermine not only his achievement but the delicate validation he had fought so hard to earn. Malcolm noticed the tension but remained composed, aware that acknowledgement of his brilliance required a steady balance between exposure and discretion. His theorem had achieved public recognition, yes, but the risk of discreditation was now real. He understood that the fight for respect extended beyond intellectual proof. It now involved navigating bias, envy, and the subtle dynamics of perception. Jordan noticed the shift immediately. People are trying to drag you down, man, he said, leaning against the wall. Don't let them get to you. They're just threatened because you proved something they didn't expect. Malcolm nodded silently, absorbing the mixture of pride and frustration. Recognition was exhilarating, but the cost was high. Every peer interaction, every evaluation, every casual remark could now carry hidden judgment, subtle undermining, or outright attempts to diminish his achievement. The pressure of public scrutiny intensified when a prominent academic forum featured his theorem in a spotlight post, discussing the hidden symmetries in intellectual insight. Malcolm's theorem, once confined to a classroom problem, had now captured the attention of professionals who understood its significance. The recognition was unprecedented for someone his age, and yet, it magnified the stakes. The higher the acclaim, the more intense the scrutiny, and the more perilous the social landscape of his achievement. Malcolm felt a mixture of exhilaration and tension as he navigated the newfound attention. Every email, every online comment, every discussion in academic circles reinforced the reality that his work was now public, and that the biases he had long endured would continue to manifest, even among those who praised him. The emotional complexity of achievement under scrutiny was profound. Validation, pride, anxiety, and vigilance coexisted in equal measure. Just as Malcolm began to feel a sense of hard-earned pride, he noticed a small cluster of peers huddled in the corner of the library, speaking in hushed tones. Their expressions were serious, calculating, and determined. One of them glanced toward him, lips pursed, eyes sharp. It was clear they were plotting to discredit his work, to challenge his recognition, and to remind him that brilliance alone could not shield him from bias or envy. Malcolm realized, with a cold clarity, that the path ahead, though paved with acclaim, was fraught with an even larger struggle, one that would test not only his intellect, but his resilience and moral courage. Malcolm Carter sat at his desk, staring at the cascade of emails, notifications, and forum replies that had accumulated overnight. Each ping of his phone, each new alert, carried the weight of public acknowledgement, the validation he had long sought, but also an undercurrent of scrutiny that reminded him of the persistent biases he navigated every day. Recognition, he realized, came not as a simple affirmation of talent, but as a complex negotiation with the expectations of a world that had rarely allowed someone like him to succeed without question. He scrolled through the comments, seeing a spectrum of reactions. Praises from mathematicians and academics recognized the subtle elegance of his theorem. Yet alongside admiration, there were threads questioning his originality, veiled suggestions that assistants had played a role, and whispers of disbelief that a black student could produce work of such precision. The duality of acclaim and doubt was exhausting, a reminder that every victory carried the shadow of systemic prejudice, even when celebrated publicly. Jordan leaned against the doorframe, watching Malcolm scroll silently. "People love you until they feel threatened," he said quietly. "Then suddenly, your genius is suspicious." He shook his head, the familiar frustration in his tone a reflection of shared history. "It doesn't matter what you've proven. They'll still try to find a reason to doubt you." Malcolm nodded, swallowing hard. He had learned this early, in subtle ways. The whispers from classmates, the side glances of teachers, the assumptions he carried in his own mind about what was acceptable to achieve, and how much he could show without facing judgment. Now the same patterns were manifesting on a broader stage. Validation was sweet, but it came laced with vigilance, an emotional tax that few around him seemed aware of. Hours passed, as he refined his theorem further, responding to questions in forums, clarifying nuances in private messages, and carefully navigating the line between sharing his insight and protecting his intellectual labor. He was aware that exposure brought opportunity, but also every endorsement, every repost, every recognition required constant attention to how his work was being perceived, interpreted, and potentially misrepresented. Then came the unexpected twist. A prestigious university, known for cultivating brilliant minds, but also for subtle, unspoken expectations about who belonged in their programs, reached out directly. The email arrived with polite formality, praising his theorem, inviting him to participate in a research program, and suggesting mentorship with prominent faculty. The words were flattering, opening doors that Malcolm had once only dreamed of walking through. But beneath the overt acclaim was a string of conditions that resonated with the familiar weight of bias. The university emphasized how representative excellence was needed, implying that as a black student, Malcolm was expected not only to excel intellectually, but to serve as an example, to fulfill a role beyond academic merit. Recognition came with invisible strings attached, subtle but unmistakable, success framed as an obligation to justify potential, rather than a reward for achievement. Malcolm sat back, staring at the screen, the emotional implications crashing over him. His theorem had brought attention, opportunities, and validation, but it had also resurfaced the subtle, persistent expectation that a black student must navigate additional pressures, simply to be recognized. The acclaim was no longer purely academic, it carried social and racial weight, echoing the experiences he had endured throughout his life. He thought back to Ms. Whitmore, to the reluctant acknowledgement of his brilliance, to the subtle tension she had felt in recognizing what he had accomplished. That same tension now appeared on a global stage, Recognition filtered through societal assumptions. Admiration mingled with doubt. And every step forward carried the possibility of exploitation. Malcolm realized that even the most prestigious validation came with its own labyrinth of expectation and bias. Jordan, sensing the storm of thought within him, leaned closer. "You've got a choice here," he said softly. "You can take the offer, use it, but be prepared for the strings attached. Or you can hold your ground, protect your work, and define success on your own terms." His words were cautionary, yet supportive, reflecting the complexity of navigating brilliance in a prejudiced system. Malcolm's mind raced as he considered the implications. Accepting the university's offer could accelerate his academic trajectory, provide access to resources and mentorship, and elevate his work to a broader stage. Yet the conditions imposed were subtle forms of coercion. The implicit requirement to be both exceptional and representative, to validate stereotypes while advancing his own interests. He realized that success here would require negotiation, resilience and emotional endurance factors far beyond the scope of pure intellect. He reviewed his theorem once more, tracing every line, every hidden pattern, the subtle symmetries that had captivated academics and students alike. The work was undeniably his, born of hours of meticulous calculation, quiet reflection, and defiance against doubt and bias. Recognition, he understood, was valuable, but it could never replace the satisfaction of having created something authentic, something wholly his own. The tension escalated when a thread appeared on a public forum, suggesting that Malcolm's theorem might not have been fully original, hinting at external assistance, and questioning whether it truly reflected his independent understanding. The subtle attacks were familiar, echoing the microaggressions and assumptions he had faced in classrooms for years. Even in the midst of acclaim, skepticism sometimes tinged with racial bias loomed, reminding him that recognition alone could never erase systemic prejudice. Malcolm's fingers hovered over the keyboard, the cursor blinking as he weighed his options, responding to criticism, clarifying authorship, negotiating opportunities. It all demanded emotional labor beyond the theorem itself. Recognition had amplified his visibility, but also magnified the subtle battles he had always faced, testing both his resilience and his capacity to maintain composure under pressure. An unexpected message arrived in the middle of the night. An anonymous commenter claiming to be affiliated with a competing academic program, suggesting that Malcolm's work should be re-examined for potential errors. The insinuation was subtle but deliberate, a quiet attempt to undermine credibility and sow doubt. The emotional weight of this challenge pressed heavily on him, echoing the classroom scoffs, social media critiques, and institutional skepticism that had followed him throughout his life. Yet Malcolm remained composed. The theorem was rigorous, elegant, and undeniable. Its logic could withstand scrutiny. He understood that the broader struggle balancing recognition, validation, and bias was far from over, and that every accolade could bring both opportunity and resistance. He felt a mixture of pride, tension, and resolve. The recognition was real, but it did not simplify the ongoing negotiation between brilliance and systemic expectation. As Malcolm considered the prestigious university's conditional offer, weighing the potential benefits against the subtle racial expectations woven into their proposal, he realized the decision before him was far more consequential than any classroom challenge or viral attention. Accepting could accelerate his path, but might demand compromises he was unwilling to make. Refusing could preserve integrity, yet limit access to resources and mentorship. The weight of the choice pressed on him like never before, hinting that the next step in his journey would not only define his academic future, but test his resilience, morality, and the boundaries of recognition itself. The auditorium was alive with anticipation, a mixture of excitements, skepticism, and silent expectation. Malcolm Carter stood at the podium, his theorem spread across the screen behind him, each equation illuminated in stark clarity. Cameras hovered, capturing every gesture, every line of proof, while an audience of academics, students, and journalists waited with bated breath. The weight of weeks, months, and years of effort, of subtle dismissal, of whispered doubts and quiet humiliation, pressed against his chest. This was more than a presentation, it was a reckoning. He began methodically, tracing each connection, each symmetry, each hidden relationship in his theorem. The logic was elegant, almost hypnotic, revealing layers that no previous observer had seen. The room was silent, except for the faint murmur of scribbling pens and the occasional click of a camera. As he spoke, he felt the emotional weight of every classroom snicker, every corrected answer, Every moment Ms. Whitmore, or a peer, had implied he wasn't capable. Each line of mathematics became both proof and protest, a declaration that brilliance existed regardless of bias. At first there were murmurs of disbelief. Some audience members leaned forward, skeptical, expecting a miscalculation or an exaggeration. But as Malcolm traced the final patterns, revealing the hidden elegance that connected variables and sequences, the skepticism faltered. The logic was airtight, the insight undeniable. Eyes widened, jaws tightened, pens paused mid-air. Here was proof, not just of intelligence, but of resilience, of persistence, of overcoming a system that had never fully welcomed him. Unexpectedly, a respected judge from the statewide competition, who had once hinted at a flaw, whispered to a colleague, "I didn't think he could carry it this far." The judge admitted, barely audible. The subtle acknowledgement echoed across the auditorium. For Malcolm, it was both gratifying and bittersweet, an admission of respect that had once been withheld, colored by bias and expectation. He allowed himself a small private smile, tempered by the knowledge that the journey was far from over. Cameras and microphones captured every moment. Social media feeds exploded with live reactions, hashtags trending. As viewers marveled at the depth of Malcolm's understanding, journalists scribbled notes recording both the theorem and the narrative behind it. The story of a black teenager whose intellect had been doubted, whose potential had been underestimated, yet who had risen to claim undeniable authority. Recognition spread like wildfire, but along with it came tension. The broader world now witnessed his brilliance, but also the lingering whispers of disbelief and subtle bias. Ms. Whitmore sat quietly in the front row, her posture tense, notebook in hand. She had watched Malcolm evolve from a student she had subconsciously underestimated, to a young mathematician whose work left no room for doubt. The quiet pride in her eyes battled with the discomfort of acknowledging a truth she had once dismissed. Malcolm, unaware of her internal reckoning, focused solely on the theorem, letting the math speak for itself, its elegance conveying every unspoken assertion of capability. The unexpected twist came mid-presentation. A question from a visiting professor intended perhaps to challenge him, served instead to highlight a nuance in his theorem that Malcolm had anticipated, but not explicitly emphasized. With calm precision, he elaborated, unveiling a hidden symmetry and a secondary relationship in the proof that left even the seasoned academics in stunned silence. The brilliance of the work was undeniable, the subtle layers previously unseen now revealed with clarity and authority. Every gaze in the room shifted. Students whispered, judges exchanged astonished glances, and even skeptics found themselves forced to acknowledge what they had previously doubted. Malcolm felt a rush of satisfaction mingled with an ache. Validation was sweet, but the knowledge of all the barriers he had faced made it layered with emotion. Every challenge, every microaggression, every doubt imposed by others, had been transmuted into a theorem so precise that it could no longer be ignored. He paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. The room was silent, the audience collectively holding its breath, as he traced the final connecting line. The applause, when it came, was thundering. Hands clapped, chairs shifted, some standing, some recording, some whispering among themselves in awe. The recognition was overwhelming, but for Malcolm, it was only partially satisfying. The theorem had proven brilliance, but it could not erase the years of subtle dismissal, the systemic biases, or the constant negotiation between talent and expectation that had defined his journey. Even as accolades poured in, Malcolm's mind was already racing ahead. He recognized that this moment, while transformative, was a step in a larger battle. The theorem, brilliant as it was, existed within a system that continued to undervalue black achievement, to question, to scrutinize selectively, to create additional hurdles for those who defied expectation. The recognition he now received was a victory, yes, but the struggle against bias and systemic prejudice was far from complete. An unexpected development arrived, as a journalist approached him with a question. "Malcolm, now that the world sees your theorem, what's next? How do you plan to ensure your work gets the recognition it deserves in academia?" The question was loaded, hinting at the broader inequities of recognition in a system predisposed to undervalue contributions from students like him. Malcolm paused, feeling the weight of both pride and responsibility, realizing that this was not merely about accolades, but about creating space for equity, acknowledgement, and respect in intellectual domains historically resistant to diversity. He spoke with clarity, voice steady, measured. The theorem speaks for itself. Recognition is one thing, But the work doesn't end with applause. There are countless students in classrooms like mine whose brilliance is questioned every day. This is proof, yes, but it's also a call to challenge the assumptions, to question the structures, to ensure that recognition is equitable and unbiased. His words resonated through the auditorium, mixing triumph with moral urgency, emphasizing that the victory was both personal and systemic. Jordan, watching from the back, felt a surge of pride tempered with the knowledge of the ongoing struggle. He had seen Malcolm endure scoffs, whispering doubts, microaggressions, and the persistent underestimation of his talent. Now the theorem validated not only intelligence but resilience, the ability to convert adversity into achievement, skepticism into clarity, and bias into motivation. As the applause faded, Malcolm stepped back, surveying the room. The faces of peers, teachers, judges, and visitors reflected astonishment, admiration, and in some cases, discomfort. The system that had long underestimated him had been confronted, not violently, not through confrontation, but through undeniable brilliance. Yet he knew that validation in a single moment, no matter how public or celebrated, was not sufficient. The work of challenging systemic bias extended far beyond one auditorium, one competition, or one viral moment. The final subtle twist arrived as he noticed Ms. Whitmore quietly scribbling notes in her notebook, her expression unreadable. There was respect there, yes, but also contemplation, the recognition that her own assumptions had been challenged in a profound way. Malcolm understood that triumph was not only measured by applause, but by the subtle, slow transformations of perception in those who had once doubted him. Her internal reckoning mirrored the societal shift he hoped to inspire, incremental, uneasy, and necessary. And then in the quiet aftermath, he realized something profound. The theorem, for all its acclaim, was only the beginning. The applause, recognition, and viral attention were powerful, but the underlying structures of bias, the assumptions embedded in classrooms, competitions, and authority, remained. His victory was significant, yes, but it was also a challenge, a mandate to continue advocating for equity, to ensure that no other student had to prove brilliance under the same invisible weight he had endured. As Malcolm stepped down from the podium, the applause echoing behind him, he understood the larger equation. The world had witnessed proof of his genius, yet the true work lay ahead. Every classroom, every competition, every authority figure who doubted him, or others like him, represented a new problem to solve, a new pattern to reveal, and a new system to challenge. Triumph had been achieved, but the journey to dismantle prejudice and create equitable recognition had only just begun. If Malcolm's story moved you, share it. Let the world see brilliance that refuses to be silenced. Like, subscribe, and join the conversation about courage, injustice, and the fight to be seen. What would you do if someone doubted your potential just because of who you are?